So we're going to carry on these discussions on what really it takes to draft a valid will and what errors could crop up in drafting a will, which could obviously affect the efficacy of one's will. So Gareth, one thing that we need to consider when drafting a will is what happens if one of your named heirs actually predeceases you. What should we know about nominating successive heirs when drafting a will?
If it occurs that somebody had predeceased you, unless we had something the likes of a substitution or a succession in place, what the executor is then forced into is to refer to the Wills Act and see what the Act actually states needs to occur in that circumstance. And I suppose the problem for you as the deceased person is that what the Act implies and what your wishes would have been may not be in alignment.
On that note, it's also important to nominate a successive executor to protect against the circumstance arising where the executor that you nominated actually predeceases you.
That is advisable, because if you don't nominate a successive executor, then what if your executor on the day or in the moment is currently unavailable, then they would need to appoint another executor for you. And if you don't nominate an executor, the master's office will nominate someone for you, which is also then not ideal. You do want to use a legal expert. Some people want to nominate their family members as executors to save on costs, but this is quite a tedious process and it is quite time consuming too. So it's important to get a professional to help you.
It's also highly technical. There's so much legal and financial knowledge that comes with the role of the executor. So you're right, absolutely. Gareth, when it comes to drafting your will, for some people it may seem equitable that they leave an asset in equal shares to, for instance, their 3 children. On the face of it, this seems fair, but what are the problems, the practical problems that can arise in doing such a bequest?
Yeah, I think when we naming specific assets or maybe just an estate to be divided up in equal shares, because we want to avoid sort of being seen or felt to being unfair, you know, we also need to look at the kind of practical nuances of it. Take something like a vehicle. You know, you might have a vehicle and that now gets left in equal shares to your 3 children. It's not very practical for 3 people to try and drive one vehicle. Similarly with property, you know, homes and houses, you know, if you look at it, let's say you have those 3 children and you leave it in equal shares, maybe 2 of the children are a bit older, maybe they have established their own lives, and one of them is perhaps maybe a student that's just about to sort of enter the workforce and they don't have their own home. Then it sort of becomes a debate between the siblings about, well, 2 of them sort of maybe want to rent it out for some income, but the other one actually needs somewhere to stay, and then there's an obligation. So, you know, it can have these secondary difficulties that you might be leaving behind, although you feel like you're being sort of fair and equal to everyone.
Yeah, so in that example, let's talk about if those beneficiaries were minors, because obviously minors have got limited contractual capacity and they're not capable of inheriting directly. So any funds, in terms of our law, any funds that are bequeathed to minor children would then be administered by the Guardians Fund until those minors are old enough. What steps can an estate planner put in place to circumvent this from happening?
In your will, you can make provision for a testamentary trust. So the power of this then is that you get to name your trustees. And these are the people that would be managing the funds for your minor heirs that you have left behind. So if you don't make provision for a testamentary trust, it would need to go into the state-run Guardians Fund, and you don't really have a say of the decisions around what the money would be used for.
And then just in terms of the residue of one's estate, which is obviously now everything that's left in your deceased estate after all the debts of the estate have been paid and after all the bequests in your will have been honoured. The residue is then what goes to your heirs. Why is it so important to deal with that residue of your estate in your will?
Yeah, I think often we think about sort of being very specific about our bequests in our will, and like you say, once all the costs and the creditors have been paid, once all of those specific bequests have been made, if there is something left over called the residue, that needs to go somewhere. And if we haven't made provision or stated that the residue goes to my spouse or equally to my children or whatever the case may be, then your will would be passed away partially intestate. And then again, the executor would be forced to look at distributing that residue in terms of intestate succession. And again, that might not line up with your exact wishes.
Exactly. So people could end up inheriting from your estate that you had not actually intended to receive any benefit, which is why estate planning is just so important.